In this video, I'm going to show you how to make your virtual drums sound as realistic as possible in 5 simple steps. Now, there are lots of genres that require real sounding drums, and honestly, this can sometimes be difficult to achieve, particularly for up-and-coming artists that are on a budget, independent artists, and all those kind of people. In order to get great sounding real drums, a lot of things need to come together. You need a really great room to record in. You also need good gear to capture the sound that you want. Not to mention a really great drum kit that's well tuned and a great player to actually play them. So there's a lot of moving parts, and if just one of those things isn't right, then that can be a massive detriment to your drum sound. However, virtual drums have none of these problems because they're already pre-packaged, they're ready to go. All you have to do is program them. However, the way that you program them will 100% determine the end result. Badly programmed virtual drums will sound bad. They won't sound realistic and your track will suffer. However, if you do this with skill and you follow the steps that I'm about to show you, then no one will ever tell the difference between well-recorded real drums and your really well-programmed drums. Now, there's a couple of options when it comes to actually programming the drums. Now, one way is to literally just use your mouse. Open up a MIDI window and just put the hits where you want them. The advantage to that is that you don't need any equipment. You can literally just do it with your laptop or your computer. However, the downside is that it is massively time consuming and also quite difficult to get a mega realistic sound. You're going to have to spend hours and hours really kind of fine tuning it. Now, another option that's probably a better one is to use something like this, just a MIDI keyboard. You'll have notes assigned to certain instruments. So you might have the bass on one key, the snare on another, and the hats and everything else, and you can kind of play along and you can maybe get a little bit more feel with it. You're still then probably going to have to go in and use your mouse to edit and fine tune some of that nuance, but it's probably a quicker way. And MIDI keyboards, if you don't want a fully weighted one, can be had pretty cheap. Now, your third option, and this is the one that I use, my preferred choice, is an actual drum kit. Now, you can pick these up fairly cheap if you just want like a really simple Yamaha or Roland or Alesis, and they will work fine. You can just sit behind it and you can actually play the drums. Or you can do what I've done and convert a real acoustic drum kit. This is a Mapex birch kit. I've swapped the heads for mesh heads, so these are completely silent. And then underneath those we have triggers that then coming out of the shells, then connecting to jack sockets. All of those then just go to a module. I'm using a Roland TD9, and that then connects to the computer through MIDI. Now, the obvious benefit to using something like this is that you can literally just sit behind the kit with your headphones on and play along. And if you're a good player, then you will get all of the nuance that you need to make your drums sound realistic. The downside is that it can be quite expensive. All in, this cost me just over $1,000. Some of the higher end Roland kits go for multiple thousands of pounds, but they are really good. So I'm going to start by playing you a small section of a song that's got virtual drums in it, and then I will take you through the 5 steps of how we achieved that sound. Okay, so the first thing to achieving realistic virtual drums is to choose a really great sample library. This has to be the starting point. There are many of them out there. The ones that I use and I recommend would be Slate Drums. SSD5 is really, really great. The sounds are unbelievable. It's particularly good for rock and country music. Superior Drummer 3 is probably the best virtual drum instrument out there, and also mega versatile. It's also got lots of expansion packs as well. Superior Drummer 3 is considerably more expensive than other ones such as Slate, but it's worth it if you're going to be using it a lot. Addictive Drums 2, also really, really good. It's probably the one that I use the least out of the three, but that would be my advice. Choose one of those three libraries as your starting point, and you're already getting some really, really great drum samples. Okay, so now we're into the tracking session of the song that I played you, and we're on to point number 2, which is all about velocities. We need to make sure that we use velocities to make our drums sound as real as possible. This might sound obvious, but I'm going to show you how we actually do that. So let's take a listen to the drums just coming into the second chorus. So one thing that we want to do here, we notice that the drums come in with a build up on the toms. Now, if you imagine a real drummer playing that part, they're going to start off softly and they're going to build up harder and harder as we get into the chorus. So that's exactly how we need to program it. So we're on the snare and the floor tom, and as you can see, we're starting off with really, really low velocities, and then it's gradually building up. Let's take a listen. Now we get into the main bulk of the chorus, and we notice that there's quite a lot of ghost notes. Those ghost notes are super, super quiet, but they are there, and they just add to the groove of the song. We have the main snare hitting on 2 and 4, but the ghost notes are kind of just in between that. Those ghost notes don't want to be anywhere near as loud as the main snare hits. Let's take a listen to them here. Now, at this point, you can probably see why, if you were doing this with a mouse or even a keyboard, this is going to be mega, mega time consuming. Whereas if you're actually playing a drum kit, whether it's an electric one or whether it's a converted acoustic one like I showed you, this is going to be way easier and quicker to achieve because you can literally just play it in. Also, just having the ghost notes there in the first place adds a much more realistic feel to the drums rather than just having the snare hit on 2 and 4. A real drummer would use that to add groove. You might not notice it very much in the final mix. It will be there. The average person might not notice it, but it just adds to the groove and to the feel of the song. Okay, now on to point number 3. This is all about timing. Now, for most types of modern music, you're going to want your drums to be tight and as close to the grid as possible. However, if you also want your drums to sound realistic, you don't want absolutely everything on the grid. Let me show you a couple of examples. So again, we're going to look at that lead into the second chorus where it's on the toms, then it goes to the floor tom and snare, into a fill and into the chorus. Now, no matter how good your drummer is, if your drummer is hitting 2 drums at the same time, like the high tom and the floor tom, they are never ever going to hit those 2 drums at precisely the same millisecond. It's just not going to happen. So you're going to get some natural flamming. We need to program that in because that is a key human part of a drum kit. So let's zoom in on some of these hits. As you can see, we've got the high tom and we've got the floor tom. And you notice that these are all offset. Okay, some a little bit more than others. That's perfect. But what that means is that when you actually play them, you're going to hear some natural flamming. The same thing happens when we move to the floor tom and the snare. You notice that these hits are slightly offset from each other. Let's see what that sounds like. Now we also have that snare flam at the end. A flam by definition is literally hitting at slightly different times, but we want to make sure that we're doing that in other places where it makes sense as well. Now a really great way to achieve this in Cubase has a quantize feature, which I'll just show you here. However, it's got a soft quantize mode here where you can trigger that and then you can set what percentage you want it to quantize to the nearest beat. So I've got mine set somewhere around 65%. What that means is if I highlight this and hit the quantize button, it's only going to drag each hit by about 65%. It's not going to put them absolutely bang on the grid. Other DAWs will have a similar feature to this, I'm sure, but if you're playing your drums in with a MIDI kit, then this can just be a really great way to get them tight, but also keep some of the human feel, keep some of the flams, keep some of that very slight timing variations intact. Okay, on to point number 4. This is all about adding extra samples. Now, if you want your drums to sound huge, particularly in a big rock or country production, then adding extra samples can be a massive help here. This is also not uncommon if you recorded real drums. And the main theme that's kind of running through all of this is that you should treat your virtual drums as if they were real drums recorded in a real room with a real player. If you treat them the same way, then you can get a result that sounds exactly the same. So if you want to augment the snare sound from what you've got on the virtual instrument, then use some extra samples, and I do that quite often. Now you can use any samples that you like, however I normally go for a room sample, particularly a kick room, a snare room, and sometimes if the song needs it, a tom room. If the toms are quite a big feature, or I just want the toms to have extra sort of presence and extra sort of bigness in the mix, then I might include a tom room sample as well. Now let's take a listen to what those extra samples sound like. So this is my kick room. So as you can hear, it's really, really big, it's really round, it's also really punchy, but it's got that room sound to it. It's got that air on top, as if it's been captured from the overheads or the room mics. That's what we want. We've also got this snare room sample as well. Let's take a listen to that. Okay, now I'm going to play the whole drums together. However, I'm going to take that kick and snare room sample out. We'll then put it in so that we can compare before and after. Now let's put them in. So those samples are just adding extra size and extra ambience to the kick and to the snare. I have got the drums routed through a little bit of compression and also a couple of reverbs as well. Those room tracks are also going through the same, but once they're added in, it just helps make the sound bigger, particularly because they're room samples as well. Now, tip number 5, this goes back to the virtual drum instrument that you actually choose. It's not a hard and fast rule. However, I 100% recommend that you choose a virtual drum instrument that allows you to export the multi-tracks of the drums. You should aim to get the drums out of that virtual instrument and into separate audio files on your DAW. So as you can see in my mix session here, the drums are programmed in SSD5, but then I've got them out of that program into individual audio tracks for the mix session. The overheads are here. We've then got a stereo rooms. We've got all of the different kicks. So we've got a kick in sample, a kick out sample. We've also got the kick room sample that I added, all of the snares. You could even separate the snare top and snare bottom mic if you wanted. We've got the hat, we've got the toms. I've bussed my toms together on a stereo track, but you could even have tom 1, tom 2, tom 3, and I've even got the ride symbol as well on this. But you might be sat there thinking, well, why do I need to do that? The truth is, you don't need to, but I just think it's a much better mindset to be treating the drums, particularly when you want them to sound as real as possible, to treat them like they are a real instrument, like they were individually recorded tracks, rather than having the constraints of working within a virtual instrument. In my opinion, doing this gives you way more control over all of the different elements. You can use any of your third-party plugins on them, which you wouldn't be able to do that if they were still inside of the virtual instrument. So as you can see here, if I load up the kick sample, I'm using the Slate VMR. I'm adding some console saturation and then using the SSL EQ and then the 401 compressor. If we go to the toms, again, I'm using a console saturation, some SSL, and then some high and low lift. This would not be possible if they were still inside the Slate program. Also, if you've got any external equipment, which I have, I've got a rack of compressors, some Dolbys and EQs and things like that, then you can also bus out to them and come back in, and you can incorporate any of that into your workflow if you want to. There's just so much more scope for sculpting the sound, and you've just got way more tools at your disposal and way more control. So I 100% recommend getting the drums out of the virtual instrument and into separate tracks in your DAW. Treat them as if they were real drums recorded live with a real drummer in a real room. Now, at this point, if you're a songwriter, it would make so much sense for you to download my songwriters checklist. Writing a great song absolutely is an art, but there's so much more that goes into it. We have to make sure that our song connects with our listeners in the way that we intend. We need to get the message across, and that comes from having a really, really strong arrangement that can then lead into a great production and a great mix. That is ultimately what is going to make your listeners want to hit the repeat button, add the song to their Spotify playlist, and even get your song on the radio and pitching for sync and to labels and stuff like that. So songwriting absolutely is an art. There's no right or wrong way, but there's still a process that we have to go through every single time to make sure that the song has the impact that we want with the end listener. And that structure is on this checklist. It's completely free. It's the exact same checklist that I go through with every single one of my production clients. Even before we hit the record button, we want to make sure that the song, the arrangement is as good and as tight as it possibly can, because that will translate then into a great production, a great mix, and a great experience for your listeners. So grab the songwriters checklist. The link is in the description below.